Okay, let's jump right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something truly fascinating, a documentary-style symposium of ideas. We're pulling together physics, psychiatry, sociology, and even epigenetics. It's all drawn straight from the prism of Odyssey's framework, specifically focusing on the 2026 extension of the Laboratory of Trials. Now, this isn't just your standard psychology overview. No, this is a fundamental paradigm shift. We're completely changing how we view complex human trauma, survival, and the incredibly heavy loads the human organism is forced to carry. We're literally moving away from seeing survival as a flaw, and instead we're going to look at it through the lens of pure biological architecture. Think about it like a systems architect for a second. When a massive skyscraper sways in a hurricane, we don't look at it and say, the building is broken, right? We know that flexibility is exactly what keeps it standing. But, in modern society, when a human being survives extreme, prolonged stress, we're so quick to label their survival mechanisms as a disorder. But what if we just stop viewing survival as a failure? What if the hypervigilance, the dissociation, what if those are actually intricate structural masterpieces? Masterpieces perfectly designed to keep the human system alive under what would otherwise be a totally crushing weight.
To really get into this, we have to step into what the sources call the Laboratoire Atelier des Épreuves, the Laboratory of Trials. And what's absolutely crucial to understand here is that this is a space of rigorous biophysics. It's strictly about anti-vulgarization. We are not dumbing things down, and we definitely aren't relying on cute poetry or metaphors. We're going to measure human stress against raw elemental materials. The framework gives us 4 very specific trials drawn right from brutal matter, and these act as reading prisms for understanding a human being under load.
Okay, so the first trial is glass. If we look at this through the eyes of a biophysicist, glass is just endlessly fascinating. It reveals this extreme fragility, but at the same time it has an unbelievable capacity to stay transparent under systemic pressure. When you apply this to the human nervous system, it perfectly translates to those moments when a person is stretched incredibly thin. They're bearing a load that makes them fragile to the touch, highly sensitive to everything around them, which we might call a hypersensory or neurodivergent state. And yet somehow they maintain a functional transparency just to survive their day-to-day life. Now, our second trial, the electrician, reveals something totally astounding about how we manage live bioelectrical risk. When someone goes through complex trauma, their nervous system is essentially handling high-voltage traumatic and relational currents, literally. The brain and the body have to figure out how to route this massive surge of bioelectrical energy without causing a complete systemic burnout. So it's all about neurological conductivity. How does the body safely ground the terrifying voltage of a perceived threat just to keep the heart beating and the lungs breathing?
That brings us to the third trial, the beam. This one is all about the architecture of bearing immense, prolonged loads without bending or breaking. It really highlights the sheer, raw mechanical resilience of the human body and mind. We're talking about pure functional survival here. People who just keep working, providing, and existing in society while internally carrying this crushing weight of chronic stress or even transgenerational trauma. The beam doesn't complain, right? It just holds the weight until its structural integrity is fundamentally compromised.
And finally, we have the fourth trial, which is the concrete mixer. This represents the active and honestly often chaotic mixture of a person's lived experiences, their environments, and their survival mechanisms. Over time, under the constant churning and rotation of daily life, this mixture eventually sets. It hardens into a permanent form. Our neurological pathways and our biological stress responses literally solidify into functional architectures that dictate how we interact with the entire world. But to actually analyze this hardened structure, well, that requires a very specific approach. Because this is all so complex, the prism of Odyssey's framework just outright refuses any simplistic reduction of the human experience. We literally can't just look at someone and say, oh, well, they're anxious. No, we have to look at their architecture through 3 simultaneous layers: the survival layer, the reduction layer, and the developmental layer. And we have to look at all of these at the exact same time from 5 different scientific and philosophical angles. It's a multidimensional approach that deeply respects the complexity of a person's lived reality. To ground all this conceptual physics in established clinical reality, let's look at this like a trauma psychiatrist for a second. Drawing on the foundational work of experts like Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk, our sources remind us that complex trauma, or CPTSD, is rarely just a single explosive event. Actually, it's a profound, prolonged disruption. It alters how we regulate our emotions, it shatters identity, and it fundamentally reorganizes a person's very sense of self. The brain's threat circuitry is permanently rewired just to survive in a constant state of emergency.
And this brings us to what is arguably the core clinical reversal of this entire explainer. From the perspective of a clinical ethicist, we are looking at a massive paradigm shift. The old model, the way modern institutions usually do it, looks at a person, sees a symptom, slaps a label on it, and calls it a disorder. But doing that often completely erases the lived history of that person. The PRISM model completely flips this on its head. It moves from symptom to function, from a clinical label to a personal history. We have to start viewing the so-called disorder as a highly organized, honestly brilliant, protective function that the body designed specifically to keep that individual alive.
Building on that, we really need to bring in the perspectives of the sociologist and the attachment theorist. Pulling from foundational work by Bowlby and Ainsworth, the big takeaway is this: human beings are not completely autonomous organisms. We are deeply biologically relational. The stability of our nervous system depends entirely on an ecology of presence, rhythms, and affective continuities. Survival is essentially a conceptual, operative organization. When we reject those purely pathologizing labels, we start to see that when a social or family structure fails to provide safety, the body simply builds its own internal fortress.
And the thing is, this fortress isn't just built in one lifetime. Looking at it through the eyes of a clinical epigeneticist, our sources highlight the transgenerational transmission of trauma. There's actual research into the FKB5 gene, which regulates our stress axis, showing that trauma literally alters our biology across generations. The contemporary human body is basically an archive. We are carrying the historical, social, and relational loads of our ancestors. We're walking around carrying their unbent beams and their broken glass right inside our own cellular architecture.
So if we're carrying all of this immense generational weight, the big question is, how do we rebuild? Well, this brings us to the solution phase the sources introduce, the clinique de lien, or the clinic of connection. This approach completely redefines the therapeutic space. Instead of a doctor just fixing a passive patient, the clinic of connection demands that the individual actually becomes the active architect of their own reconstruction. It's all about restoring those relational links that trauma severed, which allows the person to safely dismantle their own survival architecture completely on their own terms.
So how exactly is this new architecture built? The source material gives us this incredible framework called the elementary architecture of modulation. It uses the 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. But listen, not as some sort of mysticism, but as very precise conceptual tools for regulating the nervous system. Earth is anchoring and stability. Air is circulation, getting a clear systemic view. Water is adaptation and continuous memory. And fire, well, that's transformation, activation, and decision. The human organism literally rebuilds itself by modulating these 4 foundational elements to process and integrate those traumatic loads.
And the Codex Crystalline aesthetic proves that this isn't just pretty poetry, it's grounded, rigorous science. It maps these elements directly to biophysics, showing exactly how human presence regulates the system. Earth corresponds to base frequencies, like 7.83 Hz, and the literal physical weight of our bone and muscle mass. Air corresponds to the oxygenation of the prefrontal cortex. Fire represents the controlled activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and water, that's the interfacial easy water in our cells and our fascial fluidity. It's just a stunning, incredibly precise biophysical map of human systemic regulation.
When we bring all these 7 expert voices together, the PRISM framework offers a real, empowering pathway to a reconstructed system. We can actually shift the brain from a permanent state of survival and hypervigilance into a state of generative exploration. We restore the bioenergetic charge and achieve vagal co-regulation, which basically means our nervous systems actually learn to soothe each other. Ultimately, it allows a person to take the ruins of their traumatized nervous system, transform them into transmissible language, and become the active architect of their own future.
All of this leaves us with one final, profound thought to really chew on. If the things you've been told are disorders, if your deepest struggles and your most exhausting patterns are actually brilliant architectural adaptations perfectly designed to keep you alive under unimaginable weight, how does that change the way you look at yourself today? And more importantly, how does that change the way you'll rebuild your foundation tomorrow? Thank you so much for exploring the PRISM with us today. Keep architecting your world.